Alright, so now that we have set up our project, let's actually see what it looks like. First, let's open up the package.json file, which describes the project's dependencies. Notice that all of the dependencies, except Vue itself, are development dependencies. This includes the Babel JavaScript transpiler, Webpack and Webpack loaders, as well as a Webpack development server. These are the dependencies that were installed when we ran the npm install command. Notice that there are some dependencies named Babel. In case you're not familiar with Babel, it's a transpiler which enables you to use the latest JavaScript features without worrying about browser compatibility. Babel takes your JavaScript code and transforms it into code that is compatible with older versions of JavaScript, and therefore browsers. Also notice that this is where the command that we ran at the end of the last lecture is defined, as well as a build command. This command makes a production build of our application and minifies the JavaScript code, as we'll see in the next lecture. The next file I'll open is the webpack.config.js file, which is, as its name implies, the Webpack configuration file. I'm not going to go through this in details because Webpack is outside the scope of this course, but let's take a quick look at the most important parts of the configuration. Webpack makes bundles by resolving dependencies between files. It does so by following the dependencies from a start file, you could say. In Webpack terminology, this is called an entry point. In our project, the entry point is defined as the main.js file within the src directory. We'll take a look at this file in a moment. We can also see that the path at which Webpack places its output files is within a dist directory. This directory doesn't exist yet, but we'll see it soon when we build the project for production. The bundle that Webpack creates is named build.js, and this is also the file that we'll see included within our index.html file. Then we have a couple of loaders which basically tell Webpack how to treat files matching a certain regular expression. The first one is the Vue loader, which is responsible for handling so-called single file components, which is something that I'll get back to soon. Another loader is responsible for passing JavaScript files through Babel, and another takes care of image files. Scrolling down to the bottom of the file, we can see that if the node environment is production, the resulting JavaScript code is minified, resulting in a much smaller file. Let's now take a look at the index.html file. As you can see, this file is very simple. The two interesting parts here are the div with the ID of app. This is where the contents of the application will be inserted at runtime. So while this HTML is the only markup that comes back from the web server when we load the page, Vue will place our content within this element when it's ready. The other interesting thing is the inclusion of a build.js file located within the dist directory. This file contains all of our application as well as Vue itself, and this is the bundle that Webpack creates for us. This JavaScript file gets served by the Webpack development server that is included within the package.json file, and that we run with the npm run dev command as we saw in the previous lecture. Notice, however, that I have no dist directory even though I ran the code at the end of the previous lecture. This is because the build.js file is only created when we make a build of the project by running npm run build. The dev command does all of its work in memory within the development web server, so you won't actually see any files on your file system. I will make a build in one of the upcoming lectures and show you what it looks like though. Moving on, let's open up the src directory and take a short look at the app.vue file. I'll explain the contents of this file in more details in the next lecture, but for now, notice that we have some HTML markup at the top, some JavaScript, followed by CSS styles. What I want to talk a little bit about now is the JavaScript code. An object is exported, and this is actually an options object for a component, as we'll see during the next lectures. This object is very close to the object that we pass to Vue instances, as we have seen so far. So here you could add methods, computed properties, and everything else we worked with until now. One thing to notice though, is that the data property is no longer an object, but is an ES6 function which returns the data object. That's something that I will talk more about in the next lecture, so for now, All I want you to know is that an object is exported, and this object can be used to create a component. Now let's have a look at the main.js file. Here we see something that should look familiar, a Vue instance. This file is actually the entry point that Webpack uses to resolve the dependencies in our project. Because we're now using Webpack instead of adding Vue in a script tag, we need to import Vue itself into our application. That's what you see at the first line of the file. The second line imports the object that is exported from the app.vue file that we just saw. This object is then used within the render property that is passed to the Vue instance. This is something that we haven't looked at before. This is a so-called render function, which means that Vue won't take contents of the EL properties element and use it for its template, but rather use the render function for getting the template. The result is then placed within the div element with the ID of app, which we saw within the index.html file. The render property should therefore contain a function, and Vue passes an argument to this function automatically, which is a function itself that can be used to create elements with. What happens here is that the function is an ES6 arrow function, which has named the createElement function as h. The body of the arrow function then just invokes this function and passes in the component options object that was imported from the app.vue file. I realize that this may all look quite confusing at first, so let's take a moment to write a more explicit version of the render function below. So right below this function, I'll just add another render function and use a normal function here instead of an arrow function. And in here, Vue automatically pass a function, and this function is used for creating elements. So I'll name it createElement, and within this function, I will use this createElement function and invoke it, and then I'll pass the app as its first argument. Now these two approaches are identical, but the one I just wrote is probably easier for most people to read. So what it does is that it takes a function as an argument, which can create an element. We invoke this function and pass in our component options object. The createElement function can also take other kinds of values, but this is all we need in this case. So I'll just remove this one and leave the default one, but I just wanted to show you a simpler version of the render function just so it's easier to understand. Anyways, this is not super important to understand, so don't worry if you didn't. Chances are that you won't ever have to change this, but I just wanted to explain it anyways. So those were the basics of the project structure. In the next lecture, we'll dive into single file components in greater detail, so see you there.